Excellent. Thank you so much, Colleen, and good morning, everyone. Welcome. Uh, as Colleen mentioned, my name is Margaret Brigley, and Lynn and I today are very pleased to share the results of the 2025 UK Consumer Research. Just to provide a little bit of context for this presentation and the results, I do want to let you know that obviously, despite economic pressures, international travel by UK residents continues to be strong, and the UK remains a critical market for Atlantic Canadian tourism. Ultimately, this project sought to gain market insights to the UK travelers. We had a series of objectives, but the four key objectives were to assess awareness and familiarity with Canada and Atlantic Canada, also to understand the barriers or the perceived obstacles for travel to Atlantic Canada, and determine what the motivating factors might be to visit Atlantic Canada. And we also wanted to understand destination appeal. And we presented creative for each of the four Atlantic provinces and got some reactions, and including likelihood of visitation based on that ad exposure. Important to understand that this survey included some pre-qualifiers. So we didn't just talk to anyone. Of those who completed the survey, they had to hold a valid passport. In essence, you wanted them to be potential visitors. They also must had taken at least one long haul leisure trip of at least 4 nights outside the UK during the last 3 years, with at least one night spent in paid accommodation, or have definite plans to take such a trip over the next 2 years. Again, really important to understand that we wanted to talk to those who actually could be potential visitors. Half of them must have traveled to Canada within the past 3 years rather. So the methodology that was undertaken here was an online general population panel survey. Again, the audience included long haul travelers from the United Kingdom, those who travel, as I've defined. And of those, we had two distinct audiences. Half of them included those who had visited Canada in the past 3 years. That was 604 travelers. And half included those who were long haul travelers, but they had not visited Canada within the past 3 years. So over 1,200 respondents. Um, our data collection included, covered or spanned about 11 days, and it was all conducted in March. And the average completion time was just under 15 minutes. So, very importantly, I want to share with you some findings between those two distinct audiences that we looked at. And findings showed us that there are notable differences between those two audiences. And when I say the two audiences, I'm referencing those who have visited Canada recently within the past 3 years and those who are non recent visitors to Canada. And what we see is that there's a difference between those two audiences. Those who have visited Canada recently tend to be younger. They tend to be more likely to travel with a spouse or a partner or family. They tend to be more likely to be employed full time and also more affluent than non-recent visitors. Interestingly, if you look at this center one, another really important difference here is that recent travelers to Canada are more likely to have or live in London or Greater London area than non-recent visitors to Canada. So just from a profile perspective, right away we saw some interesting differences. And that also translated into behaviors. So when we looked at travel activities, we saw that those who were recent visitors to Canada um, take close to twice as many long haul trips than non recent visitors to Canada. So all of them are well traveled, but again, you can see that 5.6 trips on average among recent visitors to Canada versus just 3.4 on average. Where have they visited? Well, UK travelers have visited Canada, or those who have visited Canada in the past 3 years have explored more than twice as many different long haul destinations than non recent visitors to Canada. And we see that there are some really differences in terms of where they're traveling. Recent visitors to Canada, uh, they appear to be more well traveled and a little more adventurous, perhaps, in terms of they're traveling far away from home, and they appear to be traveling and undertaking more exploration and more adventurous travel. So there was no difference between the two audiences in terms of the percent that visit Europe. So they're as likely to travel long haul close to home. But it's once you look outside of that that there are some notable differences among those who are recent visitors to Canada. More likely to have visited the States and significantly more likely to have gone to Australia or UAE or Japan or Mexico. Same in terms of the likelihood of visiting the Caribbean, which may be more of a contained destination rather than more of a exploratory or adventurous. So, on average, recent visitors to Canada visited or took 4.2 or visited rather 4.2 destinations versus less than two destinations for non-recent visitors to Canada. Now, we wanted to understand when we looked at those, the 50% who visited Canada, those 602, where have they visited? And what we saw is that Ontario and BC, followed by Quebec and Alberta, are the top Canadian destinations for UK travelers. Visitors or visits to Atlantic Canada are not too far behind, and you'll see generally it ranges from 11% of those to 17%, with Nova Scotia being more likely most likely to have been visited. On average, we see that just over two or two and a half provinces were visited. So again, that's an average score. Interestingly, though, we saw that half of those who visited Canada took a single trip to visit multiple provinces and territories, and half of them took multiple trips to the country in the past 3 years. When we think about the length of stay, on average, UK visitors stayed more than a week in Canada. And those visiting Atlantic Canada spent on average approximately 2 to 3 nights in each respective Atlantic Canadian province that they visited on their last trip. Important to point out two things here. This 8.7 is an average score. It's so, roughly we're looking at about a week, but there's notable variance. Some are coming for a short period, could be an extended long weekend. Others, there's a notable percentage who are staying for a considerably longer period of time too. So there is variance. This is just the average. And when we see the average scores here for each of the Atlantic provinces, that would suggest that perhaps um, this was one province of many that they visited during their visit to Canada. So again, keep in mind that these are average scores only here, our average number of nights, and that there would be considerable variance within each of these provinces. So we wanted to understand why they visited Atlantic Canada. And you can see there were 604 people who had visited Canada within the past. Only a small percentage actually visited each of these provinces, but the reasons for visiting each Atlantic Canadian provinces are pretty similar. This is an unaided response. So we asked them an open-ended question why they visited Atlantic Canada. And you can see uh, we heard that it's a good destination. They like it for the scenery or nature, local history or cultural heritage, and just reputation that they heard good things about it. These were the main responses, but it's very consistent in terms of the type of response, irrespective of which Atlantic Canadian province they visited. We also wanted to understand How much are they spending? This again, you can see that there's notable variance here. And the average budget, though, for the last trip to Canada was just under £5,000. Importantly, the greater the number of days, as you would expect, the higher the spend. And there are some variations by key demographics here as well, and by, again, the length of stay. Now, we wanted to understand what provinces or territories in Canada they are aware of. And what we saw here is that Ontario, BC, and Quebec, and Alberta have the highest levels of awareness among UK long haul travelers. And awareness of the Atlantic Canadian provinces vary quite notably. There is some differences, though, here among the audience, those recent visitors to Canada versus non-recent visitors. And one that I found quite interesting is that non-recent visitors to Canada are more likely to be aware of Nova Scotia than those who have recently visited Canada, which could speak to routes or it could speak to promotions, for instance. But you will see that uh, among those who have visited Canada, more than half, ranging from 56% to 65%, are aware of the various Atlantic provinces. Now, of those who said they were aware of a specific Atlantic province, we asked them whether or not they were familiar with what there is to see and do in that province. And here you can clearly see that recent visitation to Canada clearly influences UK travelers' familiarity with what there is to see and do in each Atlantic Canadian province. Notably, so again, keep in mind these are individuals who are aware of that province, but again, notably more likely to be familiar with what there is to see and do if they had been to Canada. Um, and it doesn't mean that they had been to that province, but if they had been to Canada. So let's talk about travel intentions for a moment. We wanted to understand how, what their intentions might be to visit Canada within the next 2 years. And we saw that there's clear intention among those, particularly who have visited Canada recently, to visit Canada again in the next 2 years. And a few points here, you can see that half of those, but 47% of those who are recent visitors to Canada are actively planning for their next trip. You know, they're gathering information, planning an itinerary, making arrangements, or they've already booked it. So 47% of recent visitors to Canada are actively planning another trip to Canada. That's quite dramatically different than non-recent visitors to Canada. Only 15% said they are actively um, planning a trip to Canada. And you'll also see another important point here is the difference up at the top, the gray. 4 in 10 non-recent visitors to Canada have no interest or have just never thought of Canada as a destination to visit. And that compares to only 5% of those who had visited Canada in the past 3 years. So this really highlights how predisposed those who have visited Canada in recent years are to actually visiting Canada again. Now, we asked in this study future travel intentions for 5 different types of travel. Short trips of 3 nights or less, longer trips of 4 nights or more, trips within the UK, trips to Canada, and trips to the United States. And what we see here is that UK travelers are most likely to say they plan to take the same or more trips this year than last, with few expecting to travel less. Notably, though, many recent visitors to Canada say they never travel to Canada. So the gray is a key point of interest here, obviously. Trips to Canada, you can see that the vast majority of non recent visitors to Canada plan to either take fewer trips to Canada or have never taken these types of trips. Um, and I thought it was interesting too, given the current climate south of the border, that when you consider trips to the United States, that non-recent visitors to Canada are significantly less likely to consider a trip to the States um, than than recent visitors to Canada. Now, we were especially interested in asking how likely they are to consider visiting Atlantic Canada within the next 2 years. And here, importantly, we saw some very strong intentions, and this is before showing any of the advertising. Within New Brunswick, you can see 68% of recent visitors to Canada told us that they're likely to consider visiting in the next 2 years. That's quite notably different than recent visitors to Canada. And that trend is very similar across each province. So, again, 70% expressed some likelihood of visiting Newfoundland and Labrador versus 31% of non recent visitors. 74% recent visitors to Canada are likely to consider Nova Scotia a visit versus just under one third of non recent visitors, and similar to those in PEI. So there are a couple of very important points here. That strong likelihood to visit is notably higher among recent visitors to Canada. But those sound incredibly optimistic, very much so, almost to a point where they'd be unbelievable. So it's nice that they're going to consider it, but how likely is it that they would actually consider? We provide or applied an 80-20 rule to provide a more conservative estimate of visitation. And this is a rule that we've applied across many sectors when we've assessed purchase intent, whereby 80% of those who said they will definitely do something actually do, and 20% who say they'll likely do something or probably will do something actually do. So when we looked at the definitely and probably consideration of visitation and applied that 80-20 rule, um, the what we consider to be a more realistic um, uh, estimate estimation would be that 36% are likely to consider New Brunswick in the next 2 years, 35% Newfoundland and Labrador, 40% Nova Scotia, 41% PEI. And again, you'll really note how that likelihood is notably less among those who are non recent visitors. Now, importantly, as I mentioned at the onset, we wanted to understand what prevents them from considering Atlantic Canada as a vacation destination. And among the few barriers mentioned, there's again a very notable difference between those two audiences that warrants mention. Recent visitors to Canada, they're not negatively predisposed to coming to Atlantic Canada. They primarily tell us they have other destinations in mind or they prefer to travel somewhere else right now. And keep in mind, they're much more well traveled than the other audience. Um, 17% told us no family and friends to visit there, and then a wide range of other audiences among those recent visitors to Canada. But non recent visitors to Canada, they gave us very different reasons, and that being that um, they're just unaware. 36%, they're not sure. They don't know why they wouldn't consider Atlantic Canada. And 29% said, I just have no knowledge. I haven't looked into it. I haven't researched the place. So again, for the vast majority of non-recent visitors to Canada, there's just a complete lack of awareness or lack of familiarity, and that makes Atlantic Canada not at all top of mind. We did, however, want to understand if they were planning to visit Atlantic Canada, would they visit a single or multiple provinces in the next 2 years? And this really provides an important consideration for all of those in the sector. What we saw is that the vast majority, 70%, of recent visitors to Canada would visit multiple provinces if they visited. Non-recent visitors echo the same sentiment. So 70% told us they would visit multiple provinces. And you can see few would visit a single province only. So if they're going to travel across um, the ocean, they're going to intend to see multiple provinces. And A limited number, 7% of recent visitors to Canada said they weren't sure or they didn't know, and that's versus 2 in 10 non-recent visitors. Importantly, so we hear they want to visit multiple provinces. We wanted to understand what would their expected mode of travel between the various Atlantic provinces be. And this is interesting. You can see here, regardless of audience, the expectation would be that they're going to fly between provinces or drive between provinces. And certainly the high percentage of um, assumption that thered be air travel between provinces certainly suggests a lack of familiarity of our region, and uh, and it also may suggest just a type of travel that they're more used to. Certainly within Europe, it's quite a bit easier and more common practice to take a short flight between locations. But important for us within the sector to understand what this expectation is without that knowledge anyway about our destinations. Now, we wanted to understand what would motivate them to visit. And we shared 16 motivators or potential motivators. We assessed them. And what we saw, this is the first 8 of those 16. A lot of information here, but what this tells us is a couple of points. Um, these 8 factors, and this includes things like sightseeing and exploring distinct scenery, such as coastal towns, seeing natural wonders, such as icebergs or the world's highest tides, national, provincial, or national parks, or nature parks, wildlife viewing, like whales or bird watching, experiencing indigenous culture or heritage, visiting a historical museum or site, discovering unique culinary experiences, and relaxing at the beach. So, this is the first 8 potential motivators of 16 assessed. And what we saw here is across these, the highest level of motivation, and that would be items that they'd consider to be a main reason to visit or draw them to Atlantic Canada, are those distinct sceneries, natural wonders, and the national parks or the viewings. Again, seeing things that are distinct to a region. And importantly, you'll see that the motivation for each of these factors is consistent regardless of whether they are recent visitors to Canada or non recent visitors to Canada. So these are drawing cards to both audiences. Now, if we look at, and all of these have strong motivation. Um, if we look at the remaining 8 items that we presented and assessed as motivators, uh, wellness activities, attending a live event or festival, visiting an art gallery, water sports, winter sports, bicycling, hiking or backpacking, golfing, or hunting or fishing. There are a couple of things that I'd like to point out here. What we see on these 8 items is that there is a notable difference appearing now between recent visitors to Canada and non-recent visitors to Canada. And this really speaks to what I had mentioned earlier, that level of adventurous activity, or the type of exploration that they appear to have compared to non-recent visitors to Canada. So as you go down these factors, you can see that there becomes quite notable differences in terms of whether it would be a main reason or a secondary reason to visit. A couple of things I do want to point out. activities like golfing or hunting or fishing or even cycling, those continue to be uh, activities that are motivators to most recent visitors to Canada. So, again, 6 in 10 or more indicate that that is a main reason or a secondary reason to visit. Um, However, when we look at the non-recent visitors, the vast majority have no interest. They really do not see that as a motivator. So these would become more niche audiences, certainly within that group. We also asked unaided, so an open-ended question, uh, what are the most appealing elements of Atlantic Canada to you? And so an unaided response. And we see here that nature, the region's beauty, and the scenery are the most important elements. And you can see, again, top of mind mentions are much more prevalent among the recent visitors to Canada. In fact, non recent visitors to Canada are much more likely to say they don't know or nothing. And in fact, almost 6 in 10 suggest either of that. Again, really speaking to that lack of familiarity and um, is just not top of mind for them. But the key mentions are again the nature, the beauty, and the scenery or the landscapes. Now, we wanted to understand how important each of 5 factors are when they're considering visiting Atlantic Canada. And these items included the ability to arrange transportation to travel throughout the province or the region, being a place where all are welcome, regardless of race or sexual orientation, the ability to meet accessibility or mobility needs, the ability to fly direct nonstop from where they're from the UK, and being able to visit multiple provinces during one trip. And we asked them how important each of those were to them in considering visiting Atlantic Canada, whether it was critically important, important but not critical, not very important, or not at all important. So the gray would be not at all important here. And a few things that I do want to point out. The first being that, um, and if I look at it's critically important or important but not critical, those top box scores, you'll see that the most important items are the ability to arrange transportation to travel throughout the region or throughout the province. So, really highlights the importance of helping potential visitors to find ways to explore and find ways to travel around, making it easier for them. The other is just how important it is. The ability to fly direct. And this doesn't mean necessarily direct flights to each of the 4 provinces, but a direct flight somewhere and then an easy ability to travel around. So you can see that other items are still important to most, but just to varying degrees. Being able to visit multiple provinces during one trip is also, again, 9 in 10, something that's of keen interest, which reflects what we heard earlier, that they would like to travel or visit multiple provinces. Now, we wanted to explore a little bit about planning and researching trips to Atlantic Canada. And we asked how much time they spend planning or would spend planning an Atlantic Canadian trip, as well as how far in advance they would book a trip to Atlantic Canada. And there's some interesting differences here. What we saw is when you consider the amount of time spent planning an Atlantic Canadian trip, those who have visited Canada um, spend roughly half the amount of time planning a trip than those who are non-recent visitors to Canada. That could speak to, again, their tendency to travel more often and to different types of destinations. But it's an interesting difference. Similarly, when we look at the amount of time a trip is booked in advance, recent visitors to Canada almost, well, they book a trip um, less than half the time uh, in advance of non-recent visitors. We did want to determine where they're getting their information on Atlantic Canada. And here we see consistently, regardless of audience, that UK travelers are looking for information from multiple sources, most notably TripAdvisors, online reviews that are posted there, destination websites, websites like Expedia or Travelocity, and social media plays a much greater role among recent visitors to Canada. But for the most part, it's pretty consistent, regardless of audience. And speaking of flights, it was interesting when we asked whether or not they believe they can fly nonstop to Atlantic Canada. Vast majority, so 80% of recent visitors and 74% of non-recent visitors said yes, they can, but we can see that there's some confusion in terms of where they can fly direct. Um, and, uh, and you can see here that recent visitors to Canada are notably more likely to correctly identify that they can fly direct to Nova Scotia or Newfoundland and Labrador. But there's also some confusion in terms of whether they can fly direct to New Brunswick and PEI. And among non recent visitors to Canada, you've got just about 2/3 who are not sure. Um, and this higher mention of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador, it could really reflect the marketing of the current direct flights um, in that location right now. Another interesting point is the use of travel agent or tour operators, and we saw that the vast majority are using tour operator services. In fact, 76% of recent visitors to Canada said they would use a travel agent or tour operator to help plan, organize, or book travel, and that compares to 60% of non-recent travel uh, visitors. And in terms of the activities, they're consistent, although there are a few differences here. Booking flights and booking accommodations is most common, and that would be especially the case among those non-recent visitors who undertake that activity. So for the last part of our discussion, we want to share input on the ad evaluations. That we did for each of the 4 provinces. One of the things, though, we did before we shared ad campaigns was we asked for some feedback on key visuals that are used or could potentially be used in ads on the region. And we shared a series of 12 photos, 12 images, and we asked them how effective they felt each of these images was in attracting visitors to Atlantic Canada. And that's whether it's very effective or somewhat effective. And these included various images from throughout the region. Interestingly, we saw that while all of the image concepts hold some level of appeal to visitors, 6 images centered around nature or scenic beauty were identified as most effective in attracting visitors to Canada. So you can see here, recent visitors to Canada, 95% considered it effective each of these images, the first 3 effective and primarily very effective as well. And then that just declined slightly to these last 3. But these top 6 images were especially effective. Even the bottom 6 images were still considered effective by most. It's just the degree of effectiveness varied slightly. When we look at those recent or non-recent visitors, um, it's there's a little bit different of a story. And here, while they still consider those top 6 images to be effective, you can see that the degree of effectiveness varies somewhat. It's not quite so defined, and that's especially the case when we look at these bottom 6, and particularly those images that included. people interaction. On that note, I'm going to pass you over to Lynn, who's going to walk us through each of the ad campaigns that were assessed for each of the 4 Atlantic provinces. So, Lynn, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Margaret. Each of the campaigns really had different messaging and different intent. So the results weren't meant to be really comparative. Rather, the results are intended to provide some insight into how each campaign as a whole was received and kind of how it impacted travelers' intentions overall. And we're going to go through each of the campaigns one at a time, starting with New Brunswick, as you see on the screen. But I just want to note for the actual survey, the order of the campaigns was rotated to kind of avoid any type of bias in terms of presentation order. But that said, we'll start with New Brunswick. So after seeing the campaign, we asked them how appealing they found the campaign. And as you can see below, recent visitors, 80% found the campaign appealing versus 57% of non-recent visitors. We also asked a series of 6 statements and asked level of agreement to these 6 statements. These 6 statements were the same across all 4 campaigns. Namely, we asked them include things that are interest to them, if the campaign grabbed their attention, if it showed unique offerings, encourage them to find out more about that specific province, in this case, New Brunswick, motivated them to travel to New Brunswick in the future, and if the campaign spoke to them personally. So as you can see from the table there, recent visitors to Canada versus non-recent visitors, some big differences there. For recent visitors, the scores range from 75% to 83%, versus non-recent visitors, it ranged from 47% to 59%. We also asked them the likelihood of considering a pleasure trip to New Brunswick after seeing the ads. So recent visitors, 71% versus 31%. And when we applied that 80-20 rule that Margaret spoke about earlier, that figure goes down to 40% versus 13% for New Brunswick. Now, for the Newfoundland campaign, in terms of overall appeal, as after seeing the ads, 89% for recent visitors and versus the 77% for non-recent visitors. And then we asked those same 6 series of statements and asked their agreement. For recent visitors, the scores range from 80 to 89% versus 62 to 77%, so a little bit more of a range there. In terms of likelihood to consider a pleasure trip to Newfoundland after seeing the ads, it was 74% for recent visitors, and non-recent visitors was 40%. And after applying that 80-20 rule, that decreased to 41% versus 17%. Then we have Nova Scotia's campaign. After seeing that one, in terms of appeal, again, the results are very strong. 86% for recent visitors found the campaign as a whole to be appealing versus 72% of non-recent visitors. And for those 6 statements, for the recent visitors to Canada, it ranged from 79 to 88% versus 58% to 74%. So a range there again. Likelihood to consider Nova Scotia after seeing the campaign. Recent visitors, we had just over 3/4 that said that they were likely to consider it versus the 41%. And applying the 80-20 rule, we see about just under half for recent visitors versus about 2 in 10 for non-recent visitors. And then we move on to PEI in terms of appeal. Similar story in terms of 82% of recent visitors found the PEI campaign to be appealing versus 53% of non-recent visitors. Across the statements for the recent visitors to Canada, range from 74% to 81% versus non-recent visitors, 45 to 55%. And likelihood to consider PEI after seeing the ads, almost three-quarters would consider it among recent visitors versus about a third of non-recent visitors. And applying the 80-20 rule, you see that just over 4 in 10 versus 15%. The next graph on your screen just kind of gives us a summary of those overall findings in terms of appeal. As you can see, all campaigns perform strongly, with at least 8 and 10 deeming each to be appealing among those recent visitors. And again, it just highlights the fact that those recent visitors were more likely to find each campaign to be appealing across the board, where you see some variations amongst non-recent visitors, where it's just over half of for PEI in New Brunswick, and then around three-quarters for Newfoundland and Nova Scotia.
One thing I do want to add here that's really interesting too is remember when we showed the visuals earlier and how those top six images really appeared most effective across both audiences, and those images were most prevalent in Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia advertising, and it's really interesting how that clearly spoke more so to the non-recent visitors. So it really supported the image discussion that I had mentioned earlier.
Great. So a lot of information obviously presented on this slide, but really what it is what it provides is kind of a snapshot of results pre-ad exposure versus post-ad exposure, and how opinions changed in terms of likelihood to consider Atlantic Canada in the next 2 years. So likelihood to consider each province pre versus post campaign, there's kind of three big takeaways here. The main point is generally we see an uptick of people saying that they're likely to consider visiting each of the province following that campaign exposure. And the campaigns perform really well across the board. And again, on the screen, you can clearly see that difference between those who have recently visited Canada versus those non-recent visitors.
Wonderful. A lot of information, and I think that there will be no surprise in terms of the four key takeaways or key findings that I'd like you to consider as a result of this research. The first comment that is really important to discuss is the fact that UK long haul travelers, they exhibit diverse characteristics and behaviors, and there are clearly two different audiences, and this research identified just how different those who have visited Canada um, in the past are from those who have not visited Canada in the past. And really there are some who choose to venture farther away from home, and they seem to have a greater interest in exploration and discover. And we also see that past experience with travel to Canada has a clear and a significant impact on perceptions and on travel intentions to Atlantic Canada. And as I explained at the very beginning of this presentation, those who have visited Canada in recent years, they have a somewhat different profile, and all of those provide really important marketing direction for those in the sector when they're looking at that UK market. We also see here that UK travelers, they're open to considering Atlantic Canada as a long haul destination choice, especially those who have visited Atlantic Canada. And we saw from this research that they're really interested in flying direct to their destination, wherever their destination might be, and certainly that would suggest that greater efforts are needed to highlight the nonstop connection to the region. We do have multiple options for UK travelers. And UK travelers also, we see clearly that they want to visit multiple provinces. And when they visit, they want to be able to travel around the region or travel around the province. So as folks working within the sector, it's important that we show them those solutions and really speak to that clear desire or need that they might have. really important, though, for us to consider and remember that the region does face clear competition when it comes to the US market, despite the fact that they're open to considering Atlantic Canada. Recent visitors to Canada are well traveled. They have been many different places and they are looking to explore and they are looking to see things that are unique and places perhaps that they haven't been. So we need to continually differentiate the region clearly for them so it is top of mind. And then finally, really speaking to the advertising campaign, and as Lynn has mentioned, the current advertising campaigns for each of the Atlantic provinces, they're very well received, especially among those who are recent visitors to Canada. They showed us in this assessment that they have a positive impact on building interest in visiting multiple provinces. So we give them a reason to want to visit multiple provinces. And also, it really suggests that as ad campaigns are being considered, that consideration should be given to including the types of visuals that really uh, showcase unique geographic offerings or those distinct landscape elements, as well as something that might be awe-inspiring or encouraging their sense of discovery that they so clearly want to tap into. And that's it. So I hope that you found this information useful and of interest. And if any of you have any questions, um, if anyone has questions, they could either unmute themselves and ask or send it in the chat as well. Oh, Colleen, I'll pass the baton back to you.
Okay, if anyone does think of any questions after they receive a copy of the presentation deck and have given it more thought, my email address is actp@tiapei.ca. It's in the chat there. You can forward any other questions you might have, and we'll respond to those. And we will work to have a link for this recording and a copy of the presentation to you all by email in the next little while. So on behalf of the Atlantic Canada Agreement on Tourism, we appreciate your time and thank you very much for taking part in this presentation this morning. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.